Good afternoon, good evening, wherever on this beautiful planet you are. We welcome you from the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute and from the Rumsfeld Foundation. We want to focus today on real people, real lives, real experience, real insights, not speculation. We have today a group of 5 men and women who have lived the story of Afghanistan for the past years and who have experienced in their own lives, in their own circles, in their own families, the crisis of recent weeks, and who are here assembled to tell about it. And we've asked them all to share whatever they wish about their immediate experiences and their immediate knowledge. But because of their exceptional backgrounds, exceptional range of experience and knowledge, and if I may say, since I know them all, their wisdom, we've also asked them to share their broader thoughts on what's really happening and what we must be prepared to expect in the future. So that's where we are, and welcome everyone, welcome our wonderful presenters this morning. We're going to begin with a good friend, Shoaib Rahim, who was former acting mayor of Kabul and senior advisor to the head of peace in the Afghan government. He is presently in Ankara, but heading, I believe, to the new school in New York. You're on, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Starr, for that kind introduction. It's an honor to be on a panel among friends whom I consider patriots and individuals who have dedicated their lives to the progress and prosperity of our people, each within their capacity and their own profession. I'll try my best to stay focused and not necessarily dwell too much on the past, but have a more forward-looking approach to my intervention. But I'll just start off briefly touching on the elephant in the room, which is the question, how did it all collapse so quickly? It's a question that everybody's struggling with and trying to answer. Different people have different perspectives, and it'll be naive of anyone to try and simplify it. The story of the collapse and the way it all unfolded is very complicated. It had many driving factors, the most obvious ones being a flawed so-called peace process in Doha, which I was slightly a part of, Biden's unilateral declaration of withdrawal, as well as Ashraf Ghani's lies and eventual escape. But the story of collapse is not something that I want to get into today. What I want to do in the limited time that I have is to try and frame the conversation focusing on what has transpired in Afghanistan since August 15th, when the CAMCA Network and the Taliban forcefully took over Kabul. I'll try to look at it from 3 different points of view. First, from a security prism, then governance, and briefly from an economic point of view. I'll try more to focus on security and the economy. So starting off with the issue of the Taliban's promise of bringing security to Afghanistan. The Doha deal essentially was signed between the US and Taliban, premised on the Taliban's ability to fight ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and to prevent any terrorist attacks against American soil. That was the entire premise of the deal signed between Khalilzad and Mullah Baradar on February 29th. The Taliban PR machine is founded upon their ability to bring social order and to do away with competing centers of power. This is the promise that they've always propagated to the public, that this is who we are, we will bring order, we will bring stability. They also always speak of their ability to guarantee safety and security across the cities and districts. the same cities and districts, mind you, which they terrorized and indiscriminately attacked in the past 2 decades. The foundation of Taliban's foreign policy so far seems to be the promise of stability inside Afghanistan, as well as ensuring the prevention of threats to neighbors, be it Pakistan, Iran, or Central Asia. I want to very briefly look at this promise and whether or not we are seeing signs of them being able to deliver on this promise or not. Because so far, almost 3 months after they forcefully took over Kabul, we are seeing cracks already. First of all, the Taliban and their militants' allegiance to Al-Qaeda, to the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, IMU, to the East Turkestan Islamic movement, ETIM, and dozens of other groups, is being tested by various countries. But the Taliban so far are falling short of their promise. I think this is both due to a lack of capacity, but also due to a lack of intent within the Taliban ranks. I'll give a few examples. Badakhshan, for example, housed Chechen and ETIM fighters over the years. Now, after the Taliban rule, they roam freely and move between Kunar and Badakhshan and have open supply routes. This allows them room for training and increasing their capacity to plan and carry out any attacks in the future. Another example is a senior delegation, I think about 2 weeks ago, a senior delegation from the Taliban visited Tashkent, visited Uzbekistan. And in this meeting, based on the information that has come to me, the Uzbek government requested the arrest and delivery of 10 IMU terrorists on their list. And that commitment was given to the Uzbek officials by Maulawi Hanafi, who is the deputy of the Sheikh of Ministers. He's the second person in charge in their state. Upon his return and providing the list, the military commission inside rejected this, claiming that these people and other groups have fought beside us in this victory, and we will not betray that loyalty and betray that trust. So they have fallen short, and that has increased tension and has gotten the Uzbek government, at the very least, to recalculate and recalibrate, because they seemed very welcoming at the get-go of their takeover. Growing activity of ISIS in eastern Afghanistan and Taliban's inability to handle their attacks is demonstrating their weakness. Although we have to say that the Taliban are now branding and labeling any public resentment and public fight against them as ISIS to kind of justify their brutal attacks on them. A lot of civilians, a lot of communities are being targeted under the umbrella and the label of ISIS. And so the ISIS phenomenon has to be studied much more carefully than just simplistic announcements that are being made. I want to bring your attention to the recent statement that came out of the new SRAP, Tom West, who said that we want the Taliban to succeed against ISIS. And, so these kind of statements, I think, are very simplistic and naive. And I think we have to look into this issue far more. The only public attempt of the Taliban to deliver on their counterterrorism promise is their mediation, the mediation of Jalaluddin Haqqani, head of the Haqqani Network, between the Taliban, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, and the Pakistani government. News of this came out last week. This, of course, the top priority of the Pakistani government. No results have been gained by this mediation, but basically what I'm trying to explain is that the Taliban's main pitch to the world and the region is that we will bring stability and security, but they are falling drastically short of that promise. Another angle is the issue of criminality. Criminal activity is on the rise in cities and across the country, and the Taliban are unable to curb the rise in crime, theft, and kidnappings. Of course, there's a major economic element to this because there's an economic catastrophe that is happening. Their inability to manage and provide basic services and governance is causing this. But basically, their promise to the public that we will restore order is not coming through. And this, again, is adding to the resentment. The last point I want to make very briefly on the issue of security is the targeted killings. Despite the Taliban's announcement of public amnesty, the targeted attacks and killings of former security forces is going on, particularly focused on commandos and pilots of the national security forces. There's a large gap between what the Taliban claim is happening and the information that is coming out. Naturally, the communities and the families that these people belong to will not keep quiet, and this is going to build up. The second element I want to look at before concluding is Taliban and governance. There's a massive power dispute between the Haqqani network and the Quetta Shura, or the Dohati. Mullah Baradar and his team are almost entirely sidelined and lack the executive authority that they claim to have. So essentially, the international community wasted their investment on the TPC and the Doha office. The shots are being called by Haqqanis, the Jalaluddin Haqqani, Khalil Rahman Haqqani, and Kabul as the capital is mostly controlled by them, and over 20 provincial centers and provinces across Afghanistan. Beside the issue, not only are they unable to create an all-inclusive government, which is a major metric for their ability to govern, which is ethnically diverse, ideologically diverse, people who are not necessarily associating to the Taliban, not only are they falling short on that, they're unable to come together within their group. And that is weakening their ability to govern. What that has resulted in is their inability to provide basic services. We're talking healthcare, education, ability to pay salaries, electricity and water services are on the decline. Corruption and bribery, which is a huge metric which the Taliban identified and distinguished themselves against the previous government, is increasing among the higher ranks. News of commissions requested in passport issuance, municipality services on the rise. This again is increasing public resentment and creating more space for anti-Taliban. In the end, I want to conclude my brief intervention saying that despite what was sold to the region, to the international community by those who were pushing the Taliban as these saviors, who would come and do all these great things and deliver on the promise, at least when it comes to national interests of the United States, on the Taliban would deliver on security. So far, we have not seen the Taliban deliver on that. Their promise of cutting ties with Al-Qaeda and terrorist organizations are falling short. They clearly don't have the capacity to govern. They're increasingly losing public trust, hence an increasing resentment is creating more and more space for alternatives, primarily led by the resistance and the public distrust of the Taliban's promises and propaganda. And I think the region and the world is also growingly, increasingly frustrated. And I'll just stop here and I'll take questions at the end. Thank you very much, Dr. Starr.
Thank you very much, Shoaib. Rahim, former acting mayor of Kabul, and a very effective one, by the way. I happen to have reason to confirm that. None of this is taking place in a vacuum. The former government had a widespread diplomatic corps, representation in all the major capitals of the world. And of course, the fate of that diplomatic corps is a story in itself. And someone who can tell us about it is our next speaker, Farishita Sakhi, who actually served as an Afghan diplomat and is now at the George Mason University as a Ph.D. candidate. You're on.
Yes. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening from where friends are joining us today. Thank you very much, Dr. Starr, for your introduction. It's a great privilege to be among friends and fellows from Afghanistan. I'm glad to see them all alive and in one piece. And unfortunately, we are talking today on such a heart-wrenching topic, which is Taliban sudden takeover and the current crisis in Afghanistan. I feel sometimes that 20 years ago when I started working in Afghanistan, after the collapse of Taliban, we were still discussing the same topics of lack of state capacity to contain terrorism, regime legitimacy, humanitarian crisis, and concerns and fears of regional states from Afghanistan. Unfortunately, today we are still talking about some of those issues. The sudden, traumatic, and unpredictable takeover of Afghanistan by Taliban left both Afghans and international community in a state of shock, anxiety, and tremendous fear. And honestly, from Afghan women's side, we felt extremely betrayed by both our own internal political leaders and also by the international community. This was completely in contradiction with the conditions agreed upon Doha peace talks, which involved a power sharing mechanism and ensure a representative government that included religious and ethnic minorities and women's groups. So what I'm going to focus more in my today's topic is about the aftermath and how the situation unfolded, especially in terms of humanitarian crisis and women's rights, and also the issue of legitimacy of the state in the eyes of public and also international community. The sudden change led to chaotic evacuations, which we all witnessed. It also was followed by influx of refugees to Afghanistan neighboring countries and a huge population which was internally displaced. People still had fresh memories of atrocities committed during the first period of Taliban takeover. Therefore, the anxiety level was very high, which led to chaotic evacuation that cost the lives of many innocent men, women, children, and 11 US servicemen and women. Taliban soon after took over announced amnesty, but it was hard to trust them because of their previous deeds. Soon after announcing the amnesty, they started on the ground to indiscriminately topple the resistance forces, including innocent children and women, by using air drones, leading to complete destruction of villages and causing massive human rights violations, including genocide, extrajudicial executions, and targeted attacks. On the other hand, security has not improved. As my colleague described very in detail, Taliban not only failed the Afghan population to contain the terrorist incidents and also contain some of the incidents which were caused by their own group inside Afghanistan, as they are very much divided group and they have different sections within themselves which do not cooperate and coordinate on the same policy. At the same time, they also caused a severe, massive disappointment in the regional level in terms of containment of some of the attacks which they claim to be targeted or launched by the ISIS groups, which, as my colleague also mentioned, needs further analysis and further investigation. If ISIS was a symbolic coverage of those incidents. So that really showed that Taliban lack the capacity to contain those terrorist attacks, and that led to severe disappointment in the international and regional level. Taliban also announced their cabinet, which was not inclusive, especially in terms of ethnic minorities and ethnic and religious minorities and women representatives. They completely sidelined women from all aspects of life, especially from public appearance, from schools in the beginning, and also from decision-making processes in the government, from health sector, from different sectors. They systematically sidelined women, which really was in the beginning, which was really predictable, though they made a lot of promises in Doha that they would grant women rights and human rights, but they also made it unclear because they always framed that women rights and human rights are only allowed within the framework of Islam. And their interpretation of Islam has been always very strict. So they showed that what they promised in Doha, they did not kept up to their promises. Many women who were working in the aid sectors and they were responsible for bringing bread to their families are today hiding in their homes. A lot of these women are the widows. They are the female-headed families, especially during the last 10 years. We have more than 10,000 Afghan National Defense and Security Forces who lost their lives, and these women are the sole breadwinners to their families. So they were completely sidelined. On the other hand, not only sidelining them, but also trying to have different kind of rules, which were not very much communicated to the people. From one hand, they announced segregation at the university level for girls and boys, but on the other hand, they allowed students to join these schools. So it seems that there's a lot of paradoxical policies which are going on within their own system, and these policies are not very consistent, and they are not coherent, and they're not properly communicated to the public. That's why this fear has led a lot of women to stay at their homes and a lot of women to deprive from their economic facilities. And many of women went to demonstrations inside Herat and Kabul, but unfortunately those demonstrations were shut down by beating and by launching many physical violations against them. So the situation overall in terms of women's rights, in terms of human rights, seems very bleak. Many of civil society leaders, many of human rights leaders are still hiding from the fear of being targeted. We have also noticed in the last weeks that Taliban have targeted systematically women in different provinces. That really leaves an environment of fear and anxiety, and it prevents many from active participation, even if they allow, or even if they say that that women are protected. I think these all actions of Taliban led to lack of recognition by the international community. I think the sanctions on 10 billion worth of central government assets, the abrupt block of humanitarian aid, the flight of capital and closing down of many businesses and jobs have led to an economic crisis. People have no access to their funds, which made the daily lives difficult. The hospitals were in the beginning and still are suffering from lack of medical supplies, and many professionals have fled the country, which leaves a huge gap in the health, business and education sector. So this entire situation have left many inside Afghanistan in a state of trauma, because women during the last 20 years have changed the gender roles drastically. Women resumed political positions. Almost 25% of parliament members were women. Women were in the cabinet. Women were leading many traditional and non-traditional jobs, and they were having their own businesses and having a very active part in sustaining their families. Unfortunately, and in terms of both maternal health and child health, Afghanistan was making very drastic changes and also gaining a lot of recognition from World Health Organizations and others. Unfortunately, with this current situation, The humanitarian crisis is reaching its peak. Afghanistan is rapidly sliding into human catastrophe and will be hit by famine, hunger, cold, and leading to almost 23 million people in vicious cycle of starvation and poverty in the next 6 months, according to UN statistics and according to many other organizations. If the situation continues to remain the same, more than 95% of people are supposed to be under the poverty line in the next year. I think the current dilemma, which is that if international community accept Taliban, it means that it's colluding with its international, with the human rights violation and lack of legitimacy of government, and also a lack of its capacity to contain terrorism. That's one dilemma. On the other hand, if it's not, if the international community is not recognizing the Taliban, there is a situation of people slightly and just sliding into this vicious cycle of starvation. So what's the third way? I think the better way is to channel as much support and as much funding through the international aid organizations and make sure that these aid agencies keep women at the center of their cause and at the center of all those decision-making processes. And also there are, at the end, I just want to make some major recommendations about like how currently the world can help Afghanistan, both those who are striving to get out of Afghanistan and to seek refuge in other countries, and also those who are still inside Afghanistan. For those who are coming out, I think the region has to be more open, not only the regional countries, but also the extra-regional countries have to open more doors to Afghan refugees and provide more opportunities for quicker reintegration of them into the society. And those who are still stuck in Afghanistan and the list of evacuation or on different lists of evacuations, I think the process has to be centralized and there has to be mechanisms to ensure that they don't go through different layers before reaching their final destination. Those processes has to be simplified, and the protection of them till their cases are processed should be very much taken into account. The other issue is the issue of, again, I would focus on the humanitarian aspect. I think Taliban should have to come to a point that if they are not including the other ethnic and religious minorities into their group, if they are not serious about containing terrorism and also fighting against those groups in the longer term, though it's very difficult for them, of course, to disassociate themselves from these groups because of their long-term allegiances, but still they have to see that in the future, if they don't take these issues serious, I think they are marching the country towards a demise. They are marching towards a demise of their own regime, which will lead to further catastrophe in Afghanistan, which will lead to an unending proxy war inside Afghanistan, and it will create more human catastrophe, especially starvation, hunger, and influx of refugees to other countries. I'll stop here, and I'm open for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farishita. Sakhi, Afghanistan, on the eve of the collapse, had extensive representation abroad. It could communicate with many, many foreign countries directly through web of ambassadors and representatives. What's happened to all that?
I think currently all the embassies are trying its level best to be the real or the true voice of the Afghan people. They are trying to keep up those structures intact, and they are trying to use this avenue to raise the voices of people, especially from the humanitarian point of view. However, it depends in the future weeks about if there is a change inside this structure in Afghanistan in terms of governance, in terms of Taliban being more representative and Taliban changing the entire structure, I think that would also translate to some of the issues in the embassies. And because embassies are representing the states, they're not representing the regime. So unless the regime gets recognition or unrecognition, I think their faith is also at limbo. And many of them are also dependent highly on the financial sustainability, which is kind of trickling down. And in the future, in the coming months, I think we have to watch how each embassy can sustain on its own. The fate of these embassies are highly dependent on what will happen inside Afghanistan in terms of Taliban regime legitimacy and the change of power sharing mechanism.
So we have a diarchy with a government and claiming to be a government in Kabul, and we have a bunch of embassies abroad which do not represent that government and which are on very thin financial ice today.
And I think these embassies are doing a great job of raising the voices of people of Afghanistan. They're raising the real concerns of Afghan people, and they are the representative of the, at this stage, the representative of the people of Afghanistan at this stage.
Thank you very much. We now turn to a person with remarkable experience, long years of exposure to the military and security side of Afghan life. Lieutenant General Sami Sadat, former commander of the Afghan National Special Ops Corps, and an old friend of our institute. We're very glad to see you. You are, I'm not sure where you're located, Sami. Perhaps you could start by telling us that.
Good morning, Dr. Starr, and good day to everybody. I'm somewhere in Asia, and I'll jump into what I'm asked to talk. I think some great points by Mr. Rahimi about the metrics and the facts, and also great recommendations by our sister, Mrs. Sakhi, strongly supporting those points. I will begin with the experience. 25th February 2020. I was in CSAR. CSAR was the Combined Situational Awareness Room for both United States and Afghan military. So this was our joint command, whereby we directed airstrikes, special operations, and then support to the rest of the Afghan military corps around Afghanistan. So this was the center whereby everything came together and decisions were made. That day, we flew many missions. We conducted 4 raids into the enemy high value targets. The next day, again, we had the same, at 6 o'clock, would get together, prioritize what to do next. The next day, things were different. 26th of February, 98% of the United States support has just changed overnight in terms of the airstrikes, and confusion rose because there was a new deal signed between the United States and the Taliban. First of all, digesting the very fact that we as a government didn't know or didn't have anything to do with it, where the United States as an ally goes to our enemies and then signs a deal, and then that deal, holding us and the US military all together responsible and accountable to it was very difficult, especially for me and many of my colleagues in the US military. We were frustrated, we were angry, but as officers, there's little you could do. I think following that, there were some practical matters that, imbalanced the battlefield. First of all, the rule of engagement for the United States Air Force dramatically changed to the level that made an airstrike impossible to be conducted against the Taliban. The daily attacks in every 24 hours period to the deal was about 70 Taliban attacks in 18 provinces of Afghanistan. After the deal was signed, the US decreased Air Force missions and decreased airstrikes. The attack level went to 160 on average, and it took to 26 different provinces across Afghanistan. So this was the real change in the Taliban expanding their operation, whereby we were limited in what we can do. The Afghan government agreed with the US partners to release 5,000 high-value prisoners of Taliban that included not only the Taliban fighters, but also the drug dealers who were arrested based on financing the Taliban. And they will let go in a decree that was pushed by Zalmay Khalilzad and signed by President Ashraf Ghani. I think that was another practical matter. Not only did it allow the Taliban to gain back some of their combined experience of fighting, but also it kind of hit the Afghan military's will and motivation pretty badly. Practical matters, again, as the things went forward, then more and more restrictions were put on the Afghan military as well. We were not allowed to conduct offensive operations, in essence, not to hinder or affect the ongoing peace and negotiations. And Shoaib can tell you this, they were sitting in Doha. From my experience, they never negotiated, the Taliban never negotiated with the Afghan government directly. So everything, a linchpin between the Afghan government, the Taliban, and the United States was a person named Zalmay Khalilzad, who was a special representative, and he would kind of not present credible papers or letters. He would just come by word of mouth, persuading the Afghan side to do things, especially the government. If the government refused, oftentimes he would use senior politicians and to lobby for the cause, like President Karzai and other politicians, in order to get what he wanted to get. Nonetheless, we were cautiously optimistic about the peace deal, but as things went forward, things became more and more dire. The fact that people say that Afghanistan fell in 11 days is not right. I think the fall of small checkpoints across Afghanistan began with the lack of air support and logistical support to those checkpoints across the country immediately after February 26 in 2020. And the Taliban started attacking districts which they were not allowed to attack, and the United States couldn't respond again because this was sensitive. Then they started attacking provincial centers, and again, Khalilzad would hold the military commanders accountable or call out in Twitter publicly. He made comments about my operations that I was leading from Joint Special Operation Command Afghanistan, and he would kind of blame us and raise more the Taliban cause than the cause of what was right. So in essence, the deal breaker also held the gun in his hand. So now the military operation was authorized and controlled by Khalilzad or his group in Doha, while the real battle was happening on the ground, taking real lives. He was sitting with Taliban, having tea, and then making decisions whether or not he should allow an airstrike to go off or hold on to it. I think that also affected our president and everyone else's, mental status. I think the Afghan government went into this isolation phase. The president became paranoid, and he started making appointments that were not helpful at all, thinking that generals like me were more pro the US and they would listen to the US more than their own president. And so he started bringing back some of the old school generals that were retired. Some of them were even retired 10 years ago, the communist generals, the others, that he thought might be more loyal to them. And unfortunately, that was extremely unhelpful, because in the middle of this complex battle, until they get to know what's going on, what is new in the battlefield, things became, scrambling. I think in the real life, both the Afghan military and the US military was held back by a big, lie that was created by Ambassador Khalilzad and backed by the State Department. I have immense respect for the men and women of the United States military and our allies who served alongside us. I could see their frustration. I could hear their anger. Even today, but unfortunately, the politicians in Washington and the politicians in Kabul were either misled or they couldn't manage the whole orchestration of what we see today. I also want to mention that in a quest or in a promise to bring more security, we have just opened a very insecure matter into the world as well. On August 16, when Kabul was taken over by the Taliban, some 38,000 prisoners were released, and that also included 18,000 terrorists that were members of Al-Qaeda, and 10,000 or more were Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Some 8,000, including the leader of ISIS for Khorasan province, was among the prisoners who was released and let go back into Afghanistan, and you see today what kind of problems they're creating. I think as a military officer who served in Afghanistan, I can say three things. The first thing was it was not the Afghan military or the US military that came short or failed in Afghanistan. It was the politicians who failed us, their own nation, and probably their own mission as well. The second thing is, I think people should know that now Shoaib mentioned a couple of groups. The United States and Afghan military were fighting 22 regional and international terrorist groups in Afghanistan. So the absence of that could be self-explanatory. What will they do? I think the third point is that not to make the matters big, Afghanistan is in a spot that could become very, very risky for the rest of the world. Yes, the Taliban promised not to prevent attacks from Afghanistan into the United States. I mean, logistically, it will be impossible to attack the United States from Afghanistan. Of course, Al-Qaeda will establish their own, bases in Afghanistan, but then use North Africa or some of their, people in Europe to attack the United States or other countries. As far as my intelligence suggests, the Zarqawi Fedayeen Brigade, which is the suicide brigade led by Abu Saeed al-Tikriti, who's an Al-Qaeda member, was asked to come to Afghanistan and establish their presence in the southern Afghanistan somewhere. In the meantime, a lot of ISIS members are coming into Afghanistan, seeing an opportunity to take over from the Taliban. And I think Al-Qaeda may have a new mission, and it's not directly going to the US, but going after the US interests in the Middle East, and also about the Middle East monarchies. This is our intelligence network picking up word from inside Al-Qaeda that we should focus on the Middle East, because the Americans will retreat exactly as they retreated from Afghanistan. There may be some regional countries that have the mutual interest, and they may have offered some facilitation to do that because of a common enemy, the Arab monarchies and the US presence. I'm running a little bit out of time, but I have two more things to mention before I conclude. The first thing is Afghanistan has a very young population, and it is in the line of the poverty, as everyone mentioned. So these young men and women not being able to fly out of Afghanistan have hard choices to make. They either join the Taliban or ISIS. And I think that will be a continuous and a dangerous problem for our country for years to come. The second thing is, I think the Taliban takeover brought about an inspiration to the rest of the terrorist groups across the world, especially the Middle East. I think the Iraqi government, the Kurdi government, Syrians, Palestinians, and Israelis both are very concerned after the fall of Afghanistan, because the goosebump it kind of inflicted on the groups that are insecuring these locations as well. And I think the third thing is, unfortunately, I for one don't see the cohesion, the capability and the intention within the Taliban as an organization and also as individuals to take on some of the promises and tasks they have made to the rest of the world. I'll pause there. If there are questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Sami Sadat, a very experienced military man who has presented us a very strange picture in which the normal situation, namely that military people in the field shape reality and diplomacy follows somewhere behind. In this situation, he's presented the view that diplomacy, especially in Doha, shaped and constrained what the military could do, and that these Doha negotiations and actions and the orders that gave rise to them, which originated in Washington, that these deserve very close study in the future, figure out what really exactly happened. And let me say, in the same spirit, I wonder if we shouldn't re-examine what went on at Bonn 20 years ago, because there again, diplomatic activity led by Washington, but not entirely Washington's affair, but diplomatic activity shaped the reality on the ground in very important ways. And I suspect as time goes on, we will realize that mistakes that were committed at Bonn created something akin to a kind of birth defect in the new Afghan government, which it struggled for 20 years to overcome. But that's another matter. It seems to me today that when the military side has been neutered in a way, the question of the ability of friends of Afghanistan abroad, especially in Washington, to make sensible decisions and to implement them will be tested. And so far, it hasn't given us any grounds for optimism. One of the people whom I have long, over many years, come to listen to very closely in his thoughts on his country is our next speaker, Omar Sharifi, who's headed the American Institute of Afghanistan Studies and comes to us from New Delhi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Starr, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I mean, to be honest, most of the most important issues somehow covered by what Shoaib said, what John also mentioned and stuff, and kind of like give an overall picture of like the peace deal, the military situation, and what's going on right now. What I'm actually want to talk about here is about the nature of the Taliban and how we actually, what we're dealing with right now. The perception, when everybody talks about the Taliban, about the humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan, about the catastrophe that's going on, about the kind of pleading the Taliban to be more merciful to the women, or like trying to kind of portray them as some sort of like a government. But in fact, when we look at this group, first and foremost, we're not seeing a monolithic entity, an entity that actually kind of represents. It is at the end of the day that a militant group that never managed to transition to a political entity. I hope everybody can hear me. They never managed to do the transition to political entity. But even going from that, when we think about the Taliban in a sense as like who they are, what we're dealing with, the way everybody since the Doha Agreement somehow approached the Taliban, they looked at them as something that is capable of forming a state or actually capable of forming a government. But in fact, at least for us who are living in Afghanistan, experiencing Taliban, not only now, but actually even going back all the way to the first rule of the Taliban, for most of us, we're not dealing with a kind of an Afghan entity alone, or even like a tribal entity alone, or even like an Islamic entity alone or something. We were dealing with an ideological entity, something that is not at least part of the Taliban, but all of it. It kind of is, by the definition, it's kind of exists within an ideological kind of framework that defines their action, behavior, connection, relationship, and others. And today, and this ideology is the ideology of jihadism that somehow evolved in the course of time and now kind of take this very ugly face that actually does not recognize anything but sort of expansion and bloodshed. Now, I don't want to create some sort of like a scaremonger. It sounds here like, oh, the Taliban are like crazy and they're going to go and kill everybody and stuff. But in fact, to look at the Taliban in terms of will they be able to govern now that they are in control of Kabul, at least some parts of the country, how they will manage it. I think knowing the kind of the ideological foundation of the major faction within the Taliban, I believe personally, and based on my all research and everything, that we're not dealing with a group that actually think about governing, a group that's actually based on ruling and controlling. And ruling and controlling is something that's completely different from the idea of delivering services or actually taking care of the needs of the population. Now, people also talk about, oh, if we provide some support or even legitimize the Taliban and stuff, they might actually recognize women's rights and stuff. And now the understanding is and also this case of like the humanitarian disaster that's unfolding in Afghanistan, we need to provide some help for the population, but technically means to Taliban to, in a way, then it might kind of soften their position and in a way slowly like integrate them within sort of like an international community. But as far as I know, and as far as actually the events of the last 25 years have shown, Taliban doesn't care about being part of the international community. Maybe a group of them actually trying to somehow think of themselves as we will try to build a state, or kind of something like a function, even conservative Islamist, whatever you can call it. But even that group we see very systematically and categorically since the fall of Kabul being kind of, as Shoaib said, mentioned, being sidelined by a more ideologically committed group. And for them, they already have their own international community. And this international community kind of range from like all these extremist groups from Central Asia, from the Middle East, based on Pakistan, or like they have their own. And I think for them, that international community is something that delivered for them. They provided them with soldiers, with money, with means, an idea of like being part of a global community that actually believes in certain principles. I think that that's not the priority. Now, why that cannot be their priority? When we look at the nature of this jihadist group, that somehow that kind of emerged in South Central Asia in the past kind of 30, 35 years, you cannot keep the cohesion of these groups if you kind of take this kind of thing, if you kind of make them to do the transition to become a political party. The biggest example of that is the Mujahideen groups in Afghanistan. They came with this whole idea of like, we are Mujahideen, we have this fighting against blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, as soon as that sort of like that main idea disappeared, somehow they started to lose cohesion and in a way disintegrated into smaller groups. The same phenomenon happened in Iraq, in Syria and stuff. You see more radical groups kind of coming out of it. For the Taliban today, they already have that sort of premise, the sort of establishment that's kind of now what we call as Haqqani group is kind of a conglomerate, kind of an umbrella organization that includes all the other from Central Asian, Middle Eastern, South Asian groups that operates in them. And keeping them together is the only way to keep them together, is to actually continue to kind of propagate this idea of like almost violent jihadism. Now, do they care about providing some kind of take care of the population or actually respect human rights or women's rights or education? First, a lot of myth about the Taliban allowing girls to go to school and everything. If you look at them there in 1998, we have to kind of compare it looking at the Taliban today and the Taliban in the 90s. When they say we allow the girls to go to school, that's exactly what they said in the 1999, that we allow the girls to go to school at a certain age. And then they came up with almost precisely verbatim the same conditions, that until these conditions are met, we cannot move forward. And at the same time, if the Taliban start to kind of act or if it, even for a moment we think the Taliban as a group that has a cohesion, as a political entity, trying to act kind of as an state, that means that they're going to probably lose a lot of these very hardcore and criminally violent and kind of brutal group kind of elements that help them kill hundreds and thousands of civilians in Afghanistan in the course of the last 15 or 16 years. They will lose them. So for them, keeping that group is keeping the cohesion of this kind of jihadist elements is the priority. And that's why the whole ideology of the Taliban is not about governing, and it's about ruling. Now, what are the challenges we're facing? What happened in Afghanistan last 20 years, people talk about war and everything else. But at the same time, Afghanistan as a country transformed the way that is unprecedented in history. From connectivity to education to everything else, we can talk about women's rights, and also we kind of grew up with this idea that the human dignity and women's rights and everything is an important part of being a nation and being a country. But more importantly, the population of Afghanistan learned and get used to the fact that their state is to provide services, even a bad state, but as far as it provides services. We see that Taliban lacking that ability. Now people say that, oh, Taliban, well, if you give them the funding, then the funds will give them the means to actually act like a state. But if a group that is ideologically kind of completely, its core is an ideology, like if the best example I can give them is the Bolsheviks. If you put the Bolsheviks and the jihadism in one hand, the extreme right or extreme left, the way they operate in the stuff and the way they interact with the world, there's a lot of similarities. It will only further providing support or releasing funds or recognition for them will not change the nature of that group. It will just simply consolidate the regime. That's the fact that we are facing. And I was very surprised that when the Doha talks and everything took place, the performance was, oh, they are a group, a political group, and we're going to dance into kind of with a tune that these are going to act rationally. But we are dealing with an entity that is, its rationality is completely different from that, everything that kind of the world, or especially the United States or the West has experienced. And from an Afghan perspective, that was very clear. Why? Because if you think about even the birth of Afghanistan, and I mean, people talk about history maybe boring and stuff, but when Afghanistan was born as an independent state, kind of after the Third Anglo-Afghan War, 100 years ago, and that time there was a lot of push because it was the only independent Muslim country on earth. Ottoman Empire fell, Middle East was gone, South Asia, Central Asia, everything was gone. So there are a lot of sort of push that Kabul should become the center of the new caliphate. But in that time, the king and the founding father decided that the three principles will be the basis of a new Afghan nation state. The first was a constitution. We are Muslims, but we will define ourselves based on a law that's applicable in a particular land. Second was because we are a nation, men and women, universal education. And third was archaeology. If we are a nation, we have to have a history before religion and with religion and even post-religion. Now, if you think about fast forward 70 years later, Taliban came. The first thing is constitution abolished, women's are gone, and cultural heritage of Afghanistan destroyed. Everybody thought it's a barbaric act. It is a barbaric act. But at the same time, it was done not because of barbarism or completely ignorance. It was done because of an ideological kind of basis that looked at the whole notion of a nation state, notion of a nation that actually defined itself based on modern principles, and tried to bring it back into something that they called a sort of like a universalist, almost internationalist concept of like they're going to create it. So today, the Taliban are changed. For me, the Taliban are the Taliban. The hanging is going on, the killing is going on, the brutalities are happening. And despite some performances in the media and stuff, I believe even the elements within the Taliban who actually want to believe, because of their interactions with the international community, to build the city are being completely sidelined. And they're not like very pretty guys, in my opinion, but they were like completely whitewashed in a way that looked at least nicer to everybody else, internationals, but even they are being sidelined. So where we're going to go in these things, there are efforts to recognize Taliban. I believe that there is no way to deal with this kind of problem, this issue that's kind of now forming itself now for the first time, a territory, a recognition, and the zealousy of being part of like a successful jihad. There is no way to kind of deal with it, neither with kind of providing them with funding or recognition or being nice to them, but actually what we need is a consensus right now among the regional players and international players to actually look at this phenomenon, not as just something Afghan or just something regional, but something that's ideologically based on something that transcends boundaries and borders and will be a threat for everybody. And if that is not, if there is no consensus internationally, or at least regionally, between to kind of address this issue, dealing with the Taliban in a peaceful way, in a kind of a viceroy type that John Rosslyn mentioned before, will kind of give us more and more and more confusion. And we will be that, or we are really suffering. But I think that suffering will not be confined to the Afghans at the end.
Thank you very much, Omar Sharifi. I have a couple of questions which I will put to Sami Sadat and also to Shoaib Rahim, but let me hold these until after we've heard from our final speaker, Lotfullah Najafizada, who is a director at TOLOnews, which is itself an extraordinary phenomenon of recent Afghan history, and really a revolutionary organization in the way it functioned and its success over many years. He is now a Pritzker Fellow at the University of Chicago. You're on, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Starr. So great to be among CAMCA fellows and friends. It looks like a mini reunion that we do every year, but with a very specific Afghanistan focused, I think discussion. I hope that other friends, both Afghans and other friends from the CAMCA region, find it interesting and relevant, because we really believe in CAMCA and in the in how that region should remain together and build more ties. Because of CAMCA, I traveled to so many of these countries in the region, and I've learned so much. I think I've learned a lot from the previous speakers, friends in this session. I think I will probably briefly touch upon a few things, primarily on what's next, because that's I think that wasn't discussed much in details. But before coming to that, I think the question of what was cooking in Doha was different to what was happening on the ground. I think that is something that a lot of us raise these days as a fundamental policy question. If you look at it from one way, the Taliban promised reduction in violence. It happened, but if you look at it from another way, the Taliban today, they don't think that takeover of Kabul was a diplomatic win. They think it was a military victory. So there isn't much.
We lost him, yeah. Najafizada said we lost him.
Yes. Well, while we're waiting for that to reopen, let me raise the two questions that have been put to us by your viewers. First, a very, very specific question to Sami Sadat, General Sadat, and that is on the events of 15 August in Kabul. What happened?
I think you can write a book about it, what happened. So I can shortly answer that, Dr. Starr. I arrived in Kabul on 13th of August from the Battle of Helmand, where I was in charge of the Army Corps, and I was assigned as a Special Operations Corps commander. The next evening over Twitter, I found out that not only being commander of the Special Forces, I'm also assigned by the president to the overall security in charge for Kabul as well, which mean very, very odd because I had a lot to do anyway, and it was a position that was never, before, so it was a new thing for me. Nonetheless, I had a meeting that morning, assigned some tasks and duties, and there were, some issues boiling in Pulicharchi prison, which I sent man to contain that. Then we had some issues in the 8th police district, which we sent another QRF of special forces to contain that, until the afternoon when we heard that the president had fled the country. We were all shocked. And that's when actually command and control kind of fall apart. It started from the police, then became the army, and then it was only special forces. And if you know Kabul, Kabul is a very big province. So we still wanted to maintain the special forces to maintain Kabul. Actually, my last order for all security forces was to maintain their positions regardless of the president being absent. Now we're military, and the situation is, we call it military, basically like the martial law. And it was too late for that, Dr. Starr. It didn't hold. And everyone started running away, and it panic rose, and unfortunately, things fall apart. Some people say I was in charge of Kabul. I was in charge of Kabul only for 4 hours, Dr. Starr. That was the, so yes, you know, you can find papers I was assigned, but it was too late. I don't want to talk more about that.
And now a question briefly for Shoaib, Rahim. Who were the biggest suppliers of equipment and money to the Taliban?
Well, depends. There were a lot of factions. And each faction had different supply lines and different allegiances. Unfortunately, all of them going out of Afghanistan and sourced from outside Afghanistan. The Taliban also sourced internally using narcotics, which they still continue to do. A large part of their military capability was funded through narcotics trade, as well as the commissions which they took from the vehicles crossing from the trade, from the businessmen, basically. So the various sources and various funding, but I think that fundamentally, if the question is who is the brain or architect or strategic guide of the Taliban, I think the question is, the answer is pretty obvious, and the obvious nature of it is an example of that is that the senior representative for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the United States goes to meet the Taliban in Islamabad. That just should explain everything. So I think that reality perhaps was a premise upon which the Doha process and many other policies were built upon. And here we are today because of it.
Thank you very much. Now, finally, we go to Lotfullah Najafizada,
Yes,
director at TOLOnews, and now, thank goodness, a Pritzker fellow at the University of Chicago.
Thank you, Dr. Starr. I'm sorry for the loss of connection briefly. I thought that we had this problem only in Afghanistan, but not limited to, definitely. I think I was saying that I think so. So we talked about the foundation of what actually happened in Doha, whether Doha was a flawed module for Afghanistan, and I was saying that the Taliban who are in charge in Kabul and Afghanistan right now, they think that this was a military victory. This was not necessarily or primarily a diplomatic victory. So that forms their thinking as they go ahead. That this is not as a result of some sort of an agreement with the rest of the world. This is, they took over the country literally without much of fighting. I think it was only General Sadat, who was fighting in Lashkar-e, and then there were some fighting in Takeover, and then some in war that that I can recall. So there wasn't much of fighting happening in the country. In a lot of places, cities fell and districts fell before Taliban actually arrived in those places. So if that is the thinking of the Taliban, that the country welcomed them, and they were handed over basically the country, how would they form their policies going forward? I agree, and a lot of us have talked about it in the past, that we sense some source of disagreements among the top leadership of the Taliban on what sort of a vision there should be. But from what we hear, at least from Kabul, is that the country is, the military wing of the Taliban is definitely dominating and is having the final say. So if that is, and then what Shoaib talked about, the ISIS dilemmas and counterterrorism question, which I think is critical. I'm going to come back to that in a second. I think these are all then related to how the Taliban future government will deal with it if they are going to have a future permanent government. I think to the future scenarios, I would say, and to the pressing needs of today, I'm pro-aid. I think aid is important to flow into the country, and no matter who runs Kabul, people need help, Dr. Starr. And people need help across the country, and some of those people had nothing to do with what happened in Bonn 20 years ago, and in the past 20 years, followed by Bonn, and then what happened recently. So we have to come up with solutions to deliver aid in an efficient way, transparent way. The country has been aid dependent for not just decades, but many decades, if not centuries. So we have to find solutions for that. Whether it should be done through international NGOs, through UN. I know that certain countries, primarily the US, has this policy that no dollar should end up in Taliban's pockets. And that is affecting aid delivery and providing aid to the country. So I think that's number one, especially now that winter is just across the corner. 19 million people are facing crisis or emergency level of food insecurity. And I think 5 million children are facing acute malnutrition. That is a humanitarian catastrophe. Someone should look into it. I think two-thirds of Afghans do not have food reserves for winter, and it's just, as I said, across the corner. So on that front, I think aid and some sort of economic packages for the country and for the people of Afghanistan is quite essential. Question of legitimacy. I think that's probably a bigger debate, whether Taliban really care about it or not. I think it's first for the Taliban to set out their own vision for how they will run the country long term. Whether they're going to stick to their strict ideological religious views, or they will learn from some of the things that have happened over the past 3-4 decades. I think I agree with what Dr. Sharifi was saying, that it's the Taliban's brand to be the way they are. If you change that, it's anything else but the Taliban. But there are some, internal, I think, discussions that we're aware of to see if they can accommodate certain changes within the Taliban to be more embracing of the international community. So recognition of the Taliban or legitimacy, I think it's related to how the Taliban will introduce their long-term vision for Afghanistan. There were certain countries like Pakistan, Qatar, China, probably China first, and then Russia, and probably even Iran. Who wanted to see, who were probably interested in recognizing the Taliban, but they didn't rush. So they realized that the international pulse was something different. Some of these countries, like probably Iran and Russia and China, that they were celebrating to see U.S. with a bloody nose. But now I think they are, they are thinking twice. Probably they don't like what they wished for. So on the question of engagement with the Taliban government going forward, that is, I mean, the Taliban, and I think the message for the Taliban has been very clear that this relates to certain Taliban actions which needs to be taken. And then last is counterterrorism. I think counterterrorism defines the future of Taliban relationship with the rest of the world and Afghanistan's relationship. So the dilemma over counterterrorism is quite critical. From the discussions that I've had here in the US and with people elsewhere in the international community, my understanding is that there are growing concerns about what is going to happen to all these international terrorist groups that General Sadat and Mr. Rahim talked about. So that brings me to the last point, which is probably three things, three scenarios. So one is, okay, so these hardliners within the Taliban, they remain dominant, they don't change. They do not necessarily listen to others when it comes to softening their powers on certain things. And then that will allow international terrorists, other groups, haters of probably every country on the planet, to find this haven in Afghanistan again, and then that will force certain countries, probably including the U.S., to re-engage with Afghanistan one way or another in the coming years, if not months. So that's one. Then the second is that Afghanistan remains this pariah state, isolated land, and Taliban fails to provide services, and that there would be more of growing growing resistance and growing, I think, people's lack of, probably lack of satisfaction with certain things, and small pockets of the country will probably, rise and resist the Taliban for different reasons, primarily for lack of hope. So that might lead the country to some sort of civil war, but it's going to be a gradual one. So there isn't among the non-Taliban or anti-Taliban groups, whether within the country or outside, there isn't this cohesion and consensus on how to deal with that. I mean, as we all know, the Taliban is a very exclusive group. It's not even a Taliban inclusive group, and that might be itself a recipe for more, I think, uprising within the Taliban and outside. And then last, I think the third thing that some people are still hoping that the Taliban will be more accommodating and then form some sort of an acceptable government where some lower benchmarks are met. Their interactions with the rest of the world do not necessarily recognition, but some engagement. Which I don't think we are heading towards that direction. It has been 3 months. I think for the Taliban, they do not have years to come up with explaining their vision and provide some clarity on how they will rule Afghanistan long term. So I'll probably stop here, and I will be more than happy to intervene again if necessary. Thank you, Dr. Starr.
Thank you very much for a very sober, as all our reports have been this morning, very sober discussion. Let me now, we have several really good questions from all sorts of people, including from the former media coordinator for President Karzai, but Rather than turn to them, I want to give our panelists themselves the opportunity to respond to each other or put questions to each other, because I've watched all your heads bobbing up and down or shaking in the other direction for the last hour and a half. It's time for you to take the floor if you wish to do so.
I wanted to add one point, Dr. Starr. The point is that you see Afghanistan today on this screen, you also hear about the Taliban. So it is not the Afghanistan that people often see in the form of Taliban or in the form of us. It is divided, but also, as Lotfullah mentioned, I think the resistance is real. The situation will become more and more difficult for the Taliban, and men like you see on this screen will not just sit in the West or somewhere else idle. In one shape or form or way, we are all going to challenge the Taliban, either militarily, politically, or otherwise. I think this is an important fact that the rest of the world should know. You know, you can name it resistance, you can name it, you know, against the Taliban or whatsoever. So such is the new generation of Afghanistan that has transformed over the last 2 decades, getting exposed to the real education, to the real world, to democracy. I wanted to leave that note.
Yes, please. Farishita, you're on.
Yes, I think we all discussed about the political insecurity aspect and its implications on not only internally inside Afghanistan, but also externally on the region and exploration. But I also, again, want to take this platform and emphasize on the need of humanitarian assistance in the midst of all these chaos of legitimacy and illegitimacy of Taliban regime. We have, in the last weeks, we have received several of reports where people are selling their young daughters as young as 9 years old to prevent starvation in the families. We also have seen an increased number of street children, the boys, who are on the streets and begging. So this situation can provide really an environment for this young population to be absorbed, again, by the radical transnational criminal groups who are currently functioning inside Afghanistan and the terrorist groups. So that can in future be another catastrophe, as it happened in the past when we had a huge influx of refugees in Pakistan, which were later on indoctrinated and changed to a group such as Taliban. So in order to prevent this situation, I think more aid, whichever way is possible, need to be injected inside the Afghan economy to prevent from such a chaos.
Thank you very much. Others? Yes, please.
Dr. Starr, if I may, very briefly before Omar and friends speak. I think if I were sitting in a Central Asian capital right now in Bishkek or Tashkent or Dushanbe or Ashgabat, I would be very concerned. I would be very concerned because the policy of Central Asian states and the way they're engaging the Taliban stems from fear and stems from a point where they are very much concerned about Taliban's ability to inflict terror. But I think they're miscalculating, because what the Taliban are hyping up as an excuse for recognition, recognize us or else. And that is what essentially Muttaqi, the foreign minister of the Taliban, said. He said it's the responsibility of the world to continue aiding to support our government. If you don't complain about the consequences. If I were sitting in a Central Asian capital, I would be very concerned how my state and my government is determining how to engage with the Taliban. I think that a sober, practical way is to assume the worst. And the worst is that the Taliban either cannot or do not want to contain the elements which are a direct threat to each of those states. And no matter how many bags of rice or small cash payments you send their way, that will not change. That reality will not change. And the sad prediction and the sad forecast from that lens, that specific lens, is that like all governments, they will wake up when it's already too late. So I would be very concerned, and I would take the threat of the spread of militancy very, very seriously, and focus on that and how their governments are engaging with the Taliban.
Thank you. Others? In that case, let me, yes.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I think
Omar, you're on.
I mean, just this whole thing about the idea of aid, and obviously it's very necessary, but I remember living in Kabul in 1999, 2000, and the situation was so bad. I mean, then the UN came and they were distributing 5 loaves of bread per day per family. And that bread was made of partially like some sort of like wheat, and also had like lentils mixed with it, and some corn and everything, and it was and sawdust, all of it combined, and we had to survive on that. But the whole point, and obviously the Taliban government didn't care. We just didn't care, and they just destroyed the Buddhas of Bamyan. I remember that as but they couldn't find enough cows to slaughter to kind of, you know, bless that destruction. The whole point about that is aid is important, obviously, but at the same time, it seems that Afghans are being taken hostage. Our misery is taken as a hostage in order to actually bully everybody for aid. And then recognition, obviously recognition and stuff. I think, and at the end of the day, aid is not the answer. We remained hungry and got hungrier until the Taliban fell. I mean, it didn't help us at the end of the day. So some emergency helps at the end of the day important, but it doesn't make sense in long term. I mean, make Afghans more miserable, more dependent, put some like bread on their mouth, like a little bit so they don't die. I mean, it may kind of give Taliban some more space to live and maybe save lives. Obviously, it's important, but at the same time, it's an unsustainable model. It can go for 1 year or 2 years, something, you know, but it will not be forever. Even the UN then will not really kind of extend it by 2002 or 3 if the Taliban government will not fall. So if that anything, if any meaningful engagement with Afghanistan and aid or develop anything, without some sort of a political action, without some sort of an understanding of how we have to deal with it, at the end of the day, will prolong our misery, will make us more, in a way, question our dignity. Yes, we are hungry, we need food and everything, and that's brought because of the Taliban to begin with, period. But at the end of the day, world sympathy is necessary, but we've seen a lot of sympathy at the end of the day, and again, we fell to the kind of hands of all these terror groups.
Thank you very much, one and all. Ladies and gentlemen around the world who are watching this, I want to conclude with a note about our speakers. They happen to be all friends, not only my friends, but friends of each other. They don't agree on everything, but of course not. But what they do agree on is these are very well-educated, very experienced, very competent men and women. They represent the cream of their generation, and they exist. I think that's the important thing to remember. They exist. Yes, things are in chaos, but around the world and in Afghanistan, there are such people of a remarkable new generation. And our modest institute, the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute, has over more than the past decade collaborated with the Rumsfeld Foundation to sponsor an annual award to young men and women from around this region to come briefly to Washington and become acquainted here, but then beyond that to return and participate in a broader region-wide network. This is called CAMCA, C-A-M-C-A, which stands for Central Asia, Mongolia, yes, we include Mongolia, the Caucasus, meaning Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia, and Afghanistan. And this CAMCA Network is a group now of hundreds of young men and women who are no longer that young, but are very experienced and very competent in their various fields, diverse fields. They are region-wide. They know each other. They interact with each other. The CAMCA group has regional conventions that are the equivalent and in many ways even more impressive than the World Economic Forum, but these are specific to CAMCA countries, to Central Asia, Caucasus, Afghanistan, Mongolia, and they are the hope for the future, this generation. And I urge all of you watching to make contact with this emerging and very talented generation. They are in every field. They are absolutely cosmopolitan, yet they are deeply rooted in their respective countries and widely respected there. And they are the future. And it seems to me we should all thank our particular group this morning from Afghanistan, and do so in the realization that they are part of a much bigger international a group of men and women who are bound to be leaders in their respective countries and in the region of Central Asia, Caucasus, Afghanistan, Mongolia as a whole. So thank you very, very much, and stay tuned. There'll be more.